The Hora, or D2, the halves of signs, is a subchart that reveals the mysteries of the gender dynamics that are at the actual stan, or foundation, of human identity and the way humans interact with each other. The more that this division shows gender compatibility in those dynamics, the more attractive and effective and consistent you are. So that's really what this division is talking about. Gender dynamics which affect your appeal. Basically, the world is a spectrum with these polarities of masculinity and femininity, and one side appeals to the other, magnetizes the other. So the stronger the D2, the more the magnetism is working. The more appealing you are, the easier it is to get people to do what you would like them to do, and therefore the more effective you can be. So the D2 shows your effectiveness because it shows your attractiveness, because it shows how appealing you are, because it shows the consistency of your gender dynamic. The more that you have consistency in the D2, the more consistent you feel to people and to yourself. Therefore, the more solidity you carry, the more weighty you feel, the more important you feel, the more attractive you feel, the more stable you seem. If you want to know what this means to you and your chart, I have just released a brand new and very groundbreaking report that explores exactly that, all of the subdivisions for your chart. It's available now on my site, victorcara.com. Really quick, I would just like to share some really interesting trivia about the Hora. Hora, the word, is the basis for the word hour. You might have noticed that if you split 12 signs in half, you get 24 Horas. Another interesting thing is the word Hora is also the basic for the word horoscope. Because what a horoscope is a birth chart. And what a birth chart is a collection of planets are based on the ascendant. It's all collected around the ascendant. So by locating the ascendant in a Hora, you can then construct a horoscope. And you can see things, scope, through the perspective of the Hora, the ascendant's hourly position. The third thing that's interesting about this word is that it's not really endemically Sanskrit. It's Greek in its origin. And sure enough, the Hora concept is fundamental to the Greek 24-hour system, and it was very fundamental to Mediterranean classical astrology. How do you make a Hora? Just take the zodiac and split every sign in half. How do you differentiate these halves from each other? Very simple. The first half of every sign is the same gender as that sign. So for example, the first half of Aries is masculine because Aries is masculine. Similarly, the first half of Taurus is feminine because Taurus is feminine. So the first half of every sign has the same gender as the sign itself, and the other half is the opposite gender to the sign. What that simple pattern does for us, however, is really quite amazing. What it's actually doing, what the Hora is really doing, is taking the natural intrinsic masculine-feminine pattern of the zodiac and just offsetting it by 15 degrees. When you consider how this offset interacts with the original pattern, you see the full picture of the gender dynamics within the Horas. You should be able to see that the first Hora of any male sign is clearly male. And similarly, the first Hora of every female sign is clearly or entirely female. But the second Horas of any sign are neither entirely male nor entirely female, but somewhere on the spectrum in between. This is the full picture of the Hora's gender dynamic, and this is going to be crucial to determining how planets like or dislike their positions in the Hora. Planets that are masculine like masculine Horas. And for the sake of this calculation, use the two actually masculine planets, the Sun and Mars, and also the planets that like to be masculine. They prefer to function in a masculine way. So that's Rahu and Saturn. So those four planets, they prefer to be in masculine Horas. So for example, if you took one of those four planets and you put them in the first half of Aries, they would have 100% Hora dignity. because the first half of Aries is clearly masculine. But if you put them in the second half of Aries, they would only have 50% dignity, because the second half of Aries is half and half masculine, half feminine. Or if you put one of them in the first half of Taurus, they would have zero dignity, because there's nothing masculine about the first half of Taurus in the Hora. The opposite set of planets are the feminine planets, and include Jupiter with them, because Jupiter likes to function in a feminine way. So that would be Moon, Venus, and Jupiter. They have more dignity the more feminine their Hora is. So it's the opposite pattern. If one of these planets is in the first half of Aries, it has no dignity, because there's nothing feminine about the first half of Aries. If it's in the second half of Aries, it has half dignity. And if it's in the first half of Taurus, it has full dignity. There are still some other planets left. It's not just that every planet is either masculine or feminine. There are bigendered planets. Now, actually, Saturn is a bigendered planet, but it has a decided preference for trying to act masculine. So in the Hora, it doesn't function like a bigendered planet. It functions like a masculine planet. So we're left with Mercury and Ketu. They like to be in the bigendered sections, in the second halves of the signs. If Mercury or Ketu are in the second halves of their signs, then they have 100% Hora dignity. If they're in the first half of their signs, they still have half dignity, not zero, because by nature, they're half female and half male, so they could relate with anything. Also, the ascendant has dignity in this Hora. And the ascendant's model is, it likes clarity. So put the ascendant either in a clearly masculine Hora or a clearly feminine Hora, and it has dignity. So that means that it has dignity in the first half of any sign, but it doesn't have Hora dignity in the second half of any sign. And we're going to look at that in more detail in a minute. First, let's figure out how you can know what your Hora is. Of course, you can get my report, but you can also figure it out. It's the easiest subdivision to figure out, because there's only 2 per sign. So just put your planets onto the Hora wheel, and you can basically figure it out by eye. Otherwise, just divide the degrees by 15. Now, the new thing about the Hora, though, is that it's not a zodiacal subdivision. So we are not going to make a zodiacal chart. Typically, the chart is represented something like this, with the sun meaning masculine or solar and the moon meaning feminine or lunar. But for the report, I went ahead and made something that's a little bit visually more appealing, because I was thinking how similar this is to the yin-yang concept and so forth. So just put the planets in the Hora that they belong in. So the ascendant is in the solar masculine Hora, put it in the masculine half of this chart. But also indicate either what sign it came from, or just go ahead and indicate the dignity that it has. This particular ascendant has 0 dignity because it's in the second half of the sign, which is bigendered, and the ascendant likes clarity of gender. So we put this ascendant in the masculine half of the Hora, and we note that it has 0 dignity. Put Rahu in the lunar half, the feminine half, because it's in a lunar or feminine Hora, but also give it 0 dignity because Rahu likes masculinity. Saturn would go in the masculine half of the chart with a 50% dignity, because it's in a bigendered Hora, which is half masculine, and it likes masculinity, so it has half dignity. The moon also goes into masculine side of the Hora, but the moon doesn't like to be in the masculine side of the Hora, and it's in a clearly masculine side. So it gets 0 dignity in this masculine half in this chart. The sun and Mars, however, are both getting 100% dignity, because they're masculine planets in a masculine sign, Leo, in a masculine Hora. Mercury also gets 100% dignity, but it's going in the feminine Hora. So why is it getting 100% dignity if it's in a feminine Hora? Because it's in the second half of the sign in a feminine Hora. So it's in a bigendered feminine Hora, and that's ideal for Mercury. Ketu will always be in the same Hora type as Rahu, but won't always have the same dignity, because Rahu likes masculinity, Ketu likes flexibility between the two. In this case, indeed, Ketu actually has 50% dignity. Venus also goes into the masculine Hora, but it retains 50% dignity because it's in a bigendered Hora. Jupiter's in a feminine Hora, so right in the feminine half, but it doesn't get 100% dignity because it's in a bigendered feminine half. Now you have your Hora chart. What do you do with it? It's a little confusing because it's not a chart that you're typically used to with 12 houses and signs and so forth. The first thing you should do, the first thing I do in my report, is show you the overall dignity of the whole Hora subdivision. And you obtain that just by averaging all the dignities of every planet that's in this Hora. That will give you a pulse about the theme of the Hora, which is gender dynamic, and how that gender dynamic is contributing to your appeal and therefore your effectiveness and your underlying consistency and stability and solidity. So this particular case has mostly positive Hora, so people basically find this person appealing. They're willing to cooperate with them, therefore the person is basically effective. It's not entirely positive, but it's more on the positive side. So basically, the more positive your Hora is, the more you understand that you have appeal, natural, spontaneous, unintellectualized appeal. And therefore, the more easy it is for you to be effective and the more consistent and stable you are. Vice versa, the less positivity you have, the more unappealing you are. Therefore, the less effective your actions, because people don't really want to cooperate. And the reason why you have that lack of appeal is because there's an inconsistency in what you're projecting and what the human brain is mediating as gender dynamic. Now, of course, this is just a big general pulse of the whole Hora. You want to know specifically where are the pain points and where are the assets. So that's the next thing that I show you in the report. It's an ordered list of the planets in terms of whether they're strengths or weaknesses. So here we can see this person, it's not just that they have a generally positive Hora, but the positivity in the Hora is coming from the Sun, Mars, and Mercury. So that means that they're very appealing and effective and consistent when it comes to Sun, Mars, and Mercury and the things those planets represents, which means leadership, confidence, strength and initiative, and intellect, kind of linguistics or communications. So it's not as amorphous anymore. It's more exact where the person's appeal lies. Conversely, you can see where the pain points are. For this person, the things that's pulling down the dignity of the Hora is the low dignity of the Moon and Rahu. So even though they're very appealing in the solar and the martial and the mercurial traits, they have unappealing lunar and Rahuvian traits. So everybody is not just 100% appealing or unappealing. You're appealing in certain ways and unappealing in other ways, everybody. So this helps you figure out which ways are which. So something about the way that they're extroverting their emotions, or possibly the inconsistency or the ferocity or the intensity of the emotion and the opinion. The Rahu-Moon combination is dragging the Hora down and turning people off and making them want to stop cooperating or stop participating. So that's how you interpret a list. Your list, of course, will be different, but that's the basics of how you interpret it. I don't just leave you with the list and, tell you to sink or swim. I give you more help. I help you flesh out and verbalize what the strong planets and what the weak planets represent. There is yet another thing that the report does with the Hora in helping you zero in on where the strengths of your appeal and where the weaknesses of your appeal are. It's in grouping the dignities in terms of whether they're masculine dignities, feminine dignities, or bigender or gender-spanning dignities. So there's a key planet for each gender type. Sun is the key planet for the masculine type, Moon is the key planet for the feminine type, and Mercury is the key planet for the bigender type. And then the Lord of the key planet is also important, and then the secondary planets of that type are also important. You group up the dignities of all those planets, and you get the dignities of that particular archetype. So this particular case is saying the masculine strengths are superb. There's a lot of dignity. It's 90% dignity overall in the masculine stuff in the Hora. So that's very appealing, and you get effective action when you rely on those masculine traits. What are masculine traits? I help you identify them. Strength, for example, or confidence, leadership, dominance, or like being strong, enterprise, having ambition, and having hunger, having some competitive drive or some motivation. Those are masculine assets, and in this particular case, those are the assets that make this person effective and appealing. Whereas there's low dignity in this person's feminine strengths. When you take the moon, Venus, and Rahu, the three feminine planets, and include Mercury, the moon's lord, in the main chart, then the dignities aren't really great. So the person struggles when it comes to feminine traits. In other words, the feminine things about the person are non-attractive. They're unappealing. So that means refinement is lacking, or they're doing the refinement wrong. Gracefulness is lacking. Dexterity, they're too blunt, or they're too overly dexterous. Flexibility, they're inflexible or just too wishy-washy. Beauty, they're too much into it, or they don't give a damn about it at all. It's the feminine traits are not working. Patience, tolerance, cooperation. And then there are a third group of traits which are neither male or female, but they are something unto themselves. They're a third group. So those are traits like intelligence, relatability, the ability to span different polarities, interactivity, communication between things, objectivity, nonpartisanship, and also a health and longevity. So in this particular case, we averaged up all of the gender-spanning planets along with the lord of the key planet, Mercury, and we see a lot of dignity, again, in the Hora here. So this person has also a lot of appeal and effectiveness and consistency when it comes to those traits. So this is a great way to zero in on exactly what's appealing and unappealing about you. And the point of that is to know what your strengths and weaknesses are, so that you can therefore moderate your weaknesses and highlight your strengths. A final thing that's really, really useful that the report does with the Hora chart is to interpret the ascendant. And this is what I promised earlier we would spend a little bit more time discussing. This ascendant is described as having conflicted masculinity. The reason why it's described as masculinity is because it's in a masculine Hora. You see, it's in the solar Hora of Capricorn. The reason it's described as conflicted masculinity is because Capricorn is a female sign. So it doesn't match with the solar Hora. It doesn't match with the masculine Hora. So there's a conflict between the sign and the Hora, and the ascendant is in that division. If this ascendant was instead in the first Hora of Aquarius, then it would have been unconflicted masculinity, because Aquarius is also masculine. Similarly, if it was in the first half of Capricorn, then it would have been unconflicted femininity, and etc. You can see how the pattern works out. So it's not just that the ascendant in the second half of any sign doesn't have dignity. It's more nuanced than that. It's going to have a particular kind of gender orientation depending on the gender of the Hora, and then it's going to attain a confliction with that gender orientation. Let's explore how you interpret this basic information. There's two components here, whether it's conflicted or unconflicted, and whether it's masculine or feminine. Here are the key traits that I would identify for you with the masculinity or the femininity. Masculinity is clear-cut, but femininity isn't clear-cut, it's inclusive. It doesn't want to cut or build a wall or build a division because it likes to include things. Masculinity is definite, but femininity is much more flexible. Masculinity is bold. Femininity is not bold, it's cautious, it's prepared. And masculinity is self-oriented by nature. It has ambition and hunger and drive that it derives from itself. Femininity is group-oriented or other-oriented by its nature. The other component is whether it's conflicted or unconflicted. If you have an unconflicted ascendant Hora, then you're very comfortable with your gender trait. And therefore, because you're comfortable with these traits, you like them. So you actually kind of enjoy them, and you're therefore consistent with them and effective with them. Whereas if it's in a conflicted hora, then you're not comfortable with whatever the gender trait is. So that means that even though your nature is to behave that according to those gender traits, you don't really feel proud of that, or you don't really feel attracted to that, or you don't really feel inspired by that. And therefore you are inconsistently enthusiastic about it. And that inconsistency creates this weird magnetic pattern with your attractiveness, and also makes you less effective in how you utilize these traits, because they're not always on. They go on and off. So that's the basic idea of how you interpret your general archetype of your Hora ascendant. The report fleshes it out much more fully for you, as you can see. But before we close up on this, there's one more thing that's important to mention, is that the biological gender of a person has an impact. If your biological gender matches your Hora ascendant gender, it's a plus. The reason is simply that people look at you, assess your gender, and therefore expect certain traits. It is just the way the world works. So therefore, if what they see matches what you are, it makes it easier for you. So when the biological gender matches the Hora's ascendant gender, whether it's conflicted or unconflicted, it gets a little bit better. And conversely, when the biological gender doesn't match the ascendant Hora gender, it gets a little bit more complicated. So if you're biologically male and your Hora is unconflictedly masculine, that's just the best. But even if it's a conflicted masculinity, those masculine traits are going to kind of stick out like sore thumbs because they're conflicted. Yet you're a man. So when people look at you, what they read from you is maleness. So what they expect from you is those masculine traits. So when they see these masculine traits sticking out like sore thumbs, it's not as confusing for them. They expect it. Oh yeah, you expect that from a man. He's a man. So it becomes more forgivable, more tolerable. Similarly, if you're biologically a woman and your ascendant Hora is unconflictedly feminine, then that's the best thing you could wish for. But even if it's conflictedly feminine, and the feminine traits therefore are kind of sticking out a bit, well, people expect that from women. And that kind of helps because they are more forgiving or tolerant of your quirks because they've expected them. On the other hand, if you're biologically male, but your ascendant's Hora is feminine, then it sort of demotes or confuses the picture a bit. So even if it's unconflicted femininity, if you're biologically male, what'll happen is you have all these assets of flexibility and openness and partnershipness. But people don't expect that at first glance from a man. So it doesn't mean that it becomes unattractive. It's still attractive, but you'll definitely notice that it takes a minute for people because you're different from what they expected. So it takes them a minute to get you, to understand you, and then they find it attractive and compelling. Whereas if you're a biological man and you have a conflicted feminine ascendant, then it's just confusing. People just are confused by you. Similarly, if you're biologically female and you have an unconflicted masculine archetype, that's great because it's unconflicted. Unconflicted is always good. So here's this strong woman, here's this confident woman, here's this decisive woman, motivated woman, and that's attractive. Yet, it's not really, since it's not what people are instinctively expecting, it takes them a minute to figure you out, to get you, to understand you. And then it becomes this quirk. Here's this unusual person that's so attractive that she's unusual. Whereas if it's conflicted femininity, then yeah, here's this unusual woman, but they don't like it for some reason. Because the way that you're doing those feminine things is like half and half, on and off. So this whole Hora chart is amazing. It has amazing wealth of information in it. And I'm sure you would love to know what your Hora is saying about you. So check out the information I'm going to give you now about how you can get the report. Also, the Hora chart is very similar to the Shashtyamsa, which is the 60ths. The Hora is the halves of signs, and the Shashtyamsa is the halves of degrees. So you really want to kind of withhold your final judgment on these topics until you've looked at both of the charts. And so next week's video should be about the Shashtyamsa, the halves of degrees, so that you can see how that fits in to give you an overall picture on this topic. Now, the only remaining question is, how do you get this report so that you can get this information for yourself? That's fairly easy. You go to my website, victorcara.com, and you click on the readings link, and then you select what module you want. If you want the basic chart interpreted, get the basic module, and if you want all of your subdivisions, including the Saptamsha, interpreted, then you click to include also the subdivisions module, and then you click this to enter your birth data, and then you click this button to order it. Please don't forget to like and comment, and your likes and your comments help YouTube recognize that this video is something that should be shown to new people. So please help out with that. Thank you so much.